Basically, I got obsessed with this a few years ago, and I've done my best to try to boil it down to what I think makes the most sense to me, and I hope that I can make sense of it. We think of religious structures of belief as as mythological and like traditional and superstitious and all this. But I think what I started to notice as I listened to a lot of different thinkers, work through debates and stuff, just this idea came to me that then was kind of fortified by other people and the thoughts that they had around this subject, that maybe the way we organize beliefs is where religion came from, rather than that religion, is kind of its own distinct organization for belief. And so I started to look for patterns that were similar to my version of Christianity, which by the way was built on a sort of cognitive dissonance that was sort of like, I don't see anything that challenges Christianity. I only see what supports it, kind of thing. And I started to look at whether that just that structure of belief that did this, that all pointed toward an ideal and away from a hell, if that existed in other belief systems that were perceived to be secular, but were actually similar to, the way Christianity or Islam were built. And what I started to feel like was that they actually all are. And so that what I started to worry about was if I just give my identity over to being a conservative or a liberal or a this-ism or a that-ist or whatever, what I'm doing is I'm agreeing to the terms that all point to this ideal and away from this hell, and I'm practicing this process of denying any information that would change or challenge my belief system. And that, to me, is, I think, what I've started to understand, I think, is ideology. And so I think being a conservative or a liberal and giving your identity to that belief, I think, is the same exact thing as being, say, a Christian or a Muslim or whatever. And I guess with that being said, I'm not saying that the world is best off if we don't have Christians or Muslims or liberals or conservatives. I don't want that. But I think in my experience, I think looking back on it with hindsight, I think I wasn't really participating in my identity deeply when in the occasions where I would give my identity to one of these beliefs. I don't think I was taking full responsibility for feeling in control, not in control in a sort of tyrannical way, but feeling like I was participating in who I was, because I think I was really passing the buck off to a sense of community. And so when you're, I don't know, when I was a liberal, I just knew that a valuable thing to do would be, say, to mock some example of a conservative politician, and that would be an easy way for people to like me, and it didn't matter if what I said, if I felt like it was true. It only mattered if what I said was, socially kind of a score. So I don't know, for me, ideology is, I think it is what you said. It is, for a lot of people, a system of organizing their beliefs, and also I think a way of feeling at peace with the world, like you're contributing to it positively. But I just wonder if it's sometimes at the expense of people's true individuality.
That's a good point. I wonder if, well, then we're just, putting individuality first. Mm-hmm. Why isn't that an ideology?
Good question.
And it is true that, part of our cognitive systems is going to involve filtering the information that we get. So one of my favorite philosophers is an 18th century figure from Scotland, a guy named David Hume. Ring a bell?
Hitchens used to like him.
Yeah.
Did you ever fuck with Christopher Hitchens at all?
I read God Is Not Great.
Yeah.
Felt a little bit like a rascal. I think I was on a holiday for a family wedding. One of my aunts saw me reading it and was like, "What are you reading there?" And I was like, "Oh, God Is Not Great." And she's like, "Oh, I don't know about that, Elliot."
Yeah.
So well, let me give you an illustrative bit of Hume. I think this is one of his many excellent contributions to philosophy, is he has an argument about miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Why do people believe in miracles? And his answer is, to a great extent, on the basis of testimony, what other people tell you. You with me so far?
Yeah.
And he says, well, the wise thing to do is proportion what you believe to your evidence in the world.
Right.
And he says, well, when we're talking about miracles, we're not just talking about unusual things that happen, like, I don't know, it's snowing 3 times in a month in Winston-Salem. Like, that's kind of weird for us, but it's not a violation of the laws of nature.
Right.
Right. Miracles are supposed to be violations of the laws of nature. And then Hume says, well, if our job is to proportion what we believe to our evidence, and somebody comes up to you and tells you that they've witnessed a miracle, you have to say, well, what's more likely? That this person is mistaken, exaggerating, lying, or that they've actually witnessed a miracle. And he says, our experience of and our evidence for the laws of nature is so strong that we should usually always think that that person is mistaken.
Right.
Right. He even makes a suggestion later in this particular chapter that if you yourself experienced a miracle, well, if you're really committed to the laws of nature, one thing you might do is be like, oh man, I must be hallucinating, or I must be high. The illustrative example I like to give about this to my students sometimes when we talk about this chapter is a moment from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens.
Mm-hmm.
Right after Scrooge sees the ghost of Marley, he says, you must be an illusion. This must be just a strange dream. You're probably no more than a piece of undigested beef.
Mm-hmm.
There's more gravy than grave about you, Marley. I tend to prefer the Muppet version of A Christmas Carol, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
But so why am I on about Hume here? Well, I'm just pointing out that, filtering your experience based on your fundamental understanding of the world isn't necessarily irrationality or dogma. In fact, it's what Hume called wisdom, proportioning your belief to the evidence.
Yeah.
We have these things, and sometimes we have these interpretive frameworks of the world. And when we come to evidence that confronts them, there might be irrational versions where we push that evidence aside. But part of rationality is also not giving up your most basic beliefs on the basis of one instance. So, just because I hear one story about the Canadian healthcare system, and it's not like the Canadian healthcare system is perfect. Sometimes there are very long waits in the emergency room. Sometimes you have to wait an awfully long time for a hip replacement within, this socialized single-payer system. Well, it would be, in fact, hasty to say, so we should switch to a U.S.-style system just because it would solve these couple of problems.
Yeah.
So I guess on that sort of note, I can see what you're saying about, a blinding aspect to being in the grips of a particular ideology, especially if you're moving away from it or if you were never really all that committed to it to begin with.
Yeah.
But yeah, in some ways, we have to filter the world because otherwise we're just going to be blown about in the wind.
This I agree with. And it's been very hard as I've practiced this, as I've tried to practice just like what I can try to understand is pursuing individuality rather than pursuing ideology. I notice a real hit on my identity. Like identity itself, I find is a lot harder to lean into when you don't allow it to be preordained, like, for example, I guess there's no reason not to admit that, like, the identity of a musician, as I have pursued what I felt like was best I can tell individuality, the pre-existing identity of like the broke musician, the troubadour poet who
the starving
artist, like, it is hard for me to let that just be like that. I'll just be that model of who a person is, because like I'm avoiding pre-made identities, at least is what I think I'm doing. So, you know, there are hardships, I guess. There are things about this that are confusing, but you asked a really important question, which is, you know, if you're defining something like individuality as maybe like almost a highest value or like the goal, is that not sort of ideological in structure? And best I can tell, and maybe you can help me figure out if this is correct or not, but I've been working on this image of like what I think the difference is. And basically, I end up with a diamond pyramid both times with four ends. So basically the like Egyptian pyramid, but twice on top of each other. In an ideological structure, I think that the top of the pyramid is a goal and the bottom is hell, and that basically the ends, it doesn't even need to be shaped like a pyramid because the ends don't matter. Basically, it's a unidirectional belief system where you're going away from something and toward another thing. I think within individuality, I think what makes it feel different to me as a concept of pursuit is that rather than aiming for the top of that pyramid, I feel like I'm aiming for the middle. And what I'm doing is saying the far right is absolutely evil and the far left is absolutely evil. And the usable surface is like in a negotiation between them. And so rather than aiming for a unidirectional direction of one idea, I'm aiming for a harmony between, you know, the benefits of both sides of the spectrum. And I'm also like, yes, I do want to stay out of the bottom ends, like the depths of hell, where no matter what you do, no matter what you believe, everything is bad. But I think that is the key difference in my mind, is just avoiding the extremes that I think are horrible. And I think by conceptualizing individuality as my goal, I'm free. I feel like I'm free to negotiate with conservatives and with liberals, and not feel like I'm betraying anybody. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of sounds to me like maybe what you're interested in is like what a lot of ethicists would call value pluralism.
I've never heard of that.
Here's what a value pluralist believes. Not all good things are explained in the same way. The goodness of one good thing might not be the goodness of another good thing. So, for instance, let's see, the goodness of my donating blood at the Red Cross can be explained as a good thing to do for any number of reasons. You know, that it helps people in a time of suffering, or helps alleviate, or is essential for certain kinds of healthcare. But that might not be the same kind of goodness as when I keep a promise to somebody, or when I apologize for having hurt somebody's feelings. That all of these, you know, different values are valuable for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And then we say, like, look, you know, life isn't just about pursuing the one big thing, right? It's about pursuing a bunch of maybe irreducible. When I say irreducible, I just mean like the goodness of this one thing can't be explained in terms of the goodness of that other thing. So, you know, like the goodness of giving blood is explainable in this way. And we're talking about a whole nother thing when we talk about the goodness of apologizing for having hurt somebody's feelings.
Okay.
Right. But then there's no like top max perfect thing, right? For the value pluralist, a big part of life is to balance these competing and incommensurable goods. What you were saying reminded me of another thing that actually came up in one of my classes a week and a half ago. This was my course in medical ethics. But in one of our readings, it talked about the difference between two outlooks on the world. And this distinction was made popular by a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin. But he borrowed it from a Greek poet. Don't quote me on this, but I believe that the Greek poet's name was Archilochus.
Okay.
Said there are two different kinds of beings, or at least let me tell you about two kinds of beings. There's the fox and there's the hedgehog. And here's the difference. The fox knows many things, and the hedgehog knows one big thing. And then here's the question. How do you see yourself in the world? As a fox, where you've got a bunch of competing and maybe not even complementary goals and ideas and projects? Or are you a hedgehog? Is everything to be interpreted according to one fundamental idea? And, the examples of being a hedgehog that I could give to my students would be like maybe being the sort of person who thinks that, life is all about just making the world the happiest place it can be. If you think like that, you're what philosophers call a utilitarian. And that's your one big idea.
Yeah.
And the way that you talk about religion, that's another way of being a hedgehog, right?
Yeah.
Everything is in subservience to or to honor the word and commandment and intention of God. When I ask my students about this, like, so how many of y'all think you are hedgehogs? How many of y'all think you're foxes? It's always like a vast majority for the foxes.
That's what I figured.
And I think that like we all see in ourselves that we contain multitudes. Like my being a music lover, or trying to be a good husband, or liking to spend time with my dog. Those might be values that aren't necessarily complementary to, and may even be fighting with, my goals as, being a good teacher or being an intellectual. Life is about pursuing a lot of things, and that's a certain moral outlook. Maybe captures something of your idea of like, be an individual, live life by your own wisdom and good judgment rather than the one big idea.